I like to talk about the God quest, and I like to talk about what that means. And it does have both a theological part to it and okay. So I hope, Patricia, you can hear better now. You can't see, but you can hear. Well, you can see the windows, but you can't see me too much. But that's okay. It has a theological component to it, but it also has a very deeply spiritual component to it. And what I like about that topic is the integration of those two things, the theological with the spiritual. So, when you say, how do you even start to think about the God quest? I'd say, first of all, think about an event in your life, a person in your life, a circumstance in your life that made you think, wow, where did this come from? Wow, how did this happen? If you have ever in your life said something like, where did this come from? If you've ever thought, how did I get to this point in my life? It's a beginning of the God quest. The God quest is really a universal thing. It's not particularly Catholic. It's not particularly Christian. We end up adding something to it, Catholic Christianity, but it's something that's universal. If we believe that there is a God, and that's part of this God quest, then it's a universal thing, and there are lots of ways to kind of either think your way through it, or feel your way through it, or will your way through it. But I'm going to go with the thinking, and I'm going to go with thinking because it's rooted in Karl Rahner. And at this point, now Rahner was a 20th century theologian, Jesuit, very well known. And Rahner grappled with this question a lot, in part because he was a Jesuit. Jesuits spent forever doing spiritual formation, but also because he was a human being. And he thought of it in thinking terms, and he said, we're creatures who think. We have the capacity to think. And he said, it's one of the great things about being a human being is it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter what your language is, it doesn't matter how much education you've had, it doesn't matter, all of those other things really don't matter. Every single person has the capacity to ask questions. And what do we ask questions about? We ask questions about things that we don't know. But that we have a capacity to ask questions about things we don't know already gives us an insight about where our mind has a capacity to go, right? Those of you who had children or grandchildren, isn't it amazing the questions that little children ask? And they start asking them really early. In fact, they often start asking them even before they have words. They start babbling, right? And there's a look on their face that says, I've got a question here, and I want some answers. Every human person has a capacity to do that. And it seems that we have a capacity to ask those questions infinitely, right? Again, if you've got a kid around, and especially if the child is a little older now, 4 or 5, isn't there almost an infinite capacity to ask questions? Aren't there days that you want to say to that child, enough, I don't want to hear one more question, right? But isn't that capacity that we have to ask questions, it's what gets us to new ideas, to new inventions. If you've ever had the experience that you say to yourself, I do have a question, I just don't have the words for it yet. I know I've got a question, I don't even have the words for it. It'll come to me. As a teacher, I've seen that in students' faces. I say, you have a question? Yeah, I do. I can't put it in words yet, but I do have a question. We have a capacity to think beyond what we don't know. Now, Rahner would say, Now, he went on for pages on this, all right? I'm going to cut to the chase and say, we have, as human beings, we have a capacity to ask an infinite number of questions. But not only that, we have a capacity to think toward the infinite, right? Even though we're bound by time and space, we're limited, we're here, right? Here it is, Monday evening, the 14th day of June, in the year of our Lord 2021, a little bit after 6 o'clock. We're in this beautiful blue room, you know. We're bound by time and space. And even though you're all looking at me intently, your mind could be somewhere else, right? Your mind can be a million other places. But your mind can also think toward the infinite. It says, here we are, creatures that have that capacity to think toward the infinite. And he said, if we are creatures that have a capacity to think toward the infinite, is there an infinite out there that corresponds to this capacity that we have? Or are we destined to be frustrated forever? Now, I grant you, there are days that you say, I think frustrated forever is the answer, right? There are some days that I think, what's the meaning of life? Why am I doing what I'm doing? There's some mornings I wake up and I say to myself, who thought this was a good idea? You know, whatever it is I'm about to do. But ultimately, I believe that there is an infinite out there that corresponds to that capacity that we have. Every human being has to grapple with that question at some point. Every human being. And ultimately, that's the God question. But it's not us who really starts the God question, even though we think we do, right? In fact, when we start to reflect on it a little bit, it does seem that there is something, or more clearly, someone who is pulling us in a certain direction. You know, you ask yourself the question, why do I think about these things? Or I'm sure you know lots of people who kind of go through life and you start to talk about something spiritual, you start to talk about something a little deeper, and they say, oh no, not that again. You know, and they're not bad people. They just don't want to commit a lot of time or energy to get to that deeper question. But on some level, that question has kind of grabbed you, right? It has taken hold of you. That's what St. Augustine felt. Now, if you're saying, I've never read a word of St. Augustine in my life, that's okay. I'm pretty sure you do know one of his quotes, maybe even two of his quotes, that even if you've never heard it stated, you know it by heart. He said, late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, O beauty ever new. Now, Augustine was a seeker of wisdom. Long before he knew anything, he was on the God quest. But he never said that. He said, I'm a seeker of wisdom. I'm a smart guy. You know, my parents have provided me with a good education. So I want to just kind of see the world first. You know, his parents wanted him to go to a good law school, marry a nice girl from a nice, upstanding family, have a good law career. He wasn't born in the United States, otherwise I'm sure he would have chosen, you know, Fordham or Georgetown or Harvard or Yale. But he was born in North Africa, so he chose another law school. But he sought wisdom. When it was later in life, he heard St. Ambrose preach the gospel. And when he heard St. Ambrose preach the gospel, it changed everything. And that's when he said, late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, O beauty ever new. And the other quote that you probably know is, our hearts are restless, O Lord, until they rest in you. His whole life he had been this seeker of wisdom. His whole life he had tried to find what was going to make him happy. And he says, my heart was restless until I found you, until it rests in you. if you've ever had that restlessness, that's the God quest. And I said that's a universal question, and it is. Christianity gives it a specificity. Christianity said, well, is there any way that we come to know the infinite one, the holy one? Is there any way that we come to hear that? Well, our ancestors in faith, our Jewish ancestors in faith, they knew it through the events of history, right? They believed that God called them and that they were to live by a certain covenant. And that's the way they came to know it. And they knew that God traveled with them. It's one of the interesting things about Judaism. Many religions, they found God in a certain place, and then they built something there, and they said, this is where God is. Remember in the beginning, for a very long time in Israel, God said, don't build me a house. Stick me in a box and carry that box around with you. Isn't that amazing? They took God with them. God went with them wherever they went. God went with them up the mountain, down the mountain, through the desert, across the sea. They took God with them wherever they went. God wasn't found in a particular place. God went with them. That was kind of one of the ways that our Jewish ancestors perceived this God quest. But eventually, in a certain time, in a certain place, one of those Jewish ancestors not only could speak the Word of God convincingly, not only could interpret the Word of God convincingly, when people met him, they said, this man not only knows about God, here's somebody that when he preaches, when he teaches, when he talks to me, it is as if God is right here. God is here. And that's the person we call Jesus. The belief that we have in the incarnation is that of all the ways that God could have chosen to fully reveal himself, God's God, right? God can do whatever he wants. Of all the ways that God could have chosen to fully reveal the godness of God, what God chose to do was to become human. Isn't that amazing? God chose to be human. And so there is something about being human, something about having a capacity to ask questions, something about being drawn by certain questions that is, in fact, revelatory about who God is. Right? And when we are baptized into that Christianity, when we're baptized, you say, what do we do? Peggy was just telling me her grandson was baptized yesterday. And I wasn't there, but I have a pretty good idea what happened, right? He probably came in with a white garment on. But the baptismal ritual says, after the baptism, after we pour the water, after we mark him with the sign of the cross, then it says, put on Christ. And we put on Christ by wearing a white garment. Now, my family, that white garment's really important because my great-grandmother made a dress for my grandmother. My grandmother and her two sisters. Now, only my grandmother had children, so my grandmother wore it, then my mother and her 7 sisters wore it, and every other kid that's ever been born in our family has worn this dress. In fact, if you don't get baptized in the dress, it doesn't count. I don't care what the priest says, I don't care what the priest does, or the deacon, whoever, if that kid doesn't have the dress on, it really doesn't count. It's really important to that, but it's really what it is putting on Christ, and it's not just the garment. Our lives then become, or should become, kind of this conformed to Christ, configured to Christ. Go back and read St. Paul, we have become new people. We are now named Christian. You're not born Christian. Even if your family was Christian back to the time of Jesus, you're not born Christian. Christian. And you become Christian when you put on Christ. But putting on Christ means that I will conform my life, configure my life to do what Christ did. Now, at one point in my teaching career, I had to do a little unit, and let me stress a little unit on world religions. And part of this little unit on world religions was to say, all right, what are the major religions? Who founded them? And if you could boil their message down to one word, what would it be? Well, Christianity was love. Isn't that a great way to think about Christianity? You know, who was it founded by? Jesus. Where? Palestine. When? The beginning of the Common Era. And if you could boil down his message into one word, what would it be? Love. So if you say, if you're going to configure your life to Christ, if you're going to conform your life to Christ, what do? You love. That's what you do. Now, that's a lot easier to say than it is to do, isn't it? Because then you say, what's the loving thing to do? Today, what's the loving thing to do? In this circumstance, what's the loving thing to do? You know, in a way, Valentine's Day ought to be one of our most important days of the church year. Not because you buy candy and flowers and all the rest, because it focuses on how we love. How do we love? What do we do to love? It's just so central to what Christianity is all about. So when you say that we're in the God quest, and if you say I'm in the God quest as a Catholic Christian, part of what you say is, all right, how do I live my life, the whole of my life, in a way that demonstrates love? How do I love this person? How do I do the loving thing in this circumstance? How do I make the loving choice when sometimes there are two goods that I have to choose between? And how do I do the loving thing? How do I make the loving choice when sometimes they're both kind of awful? Right? We've all been in circumstances where we have tough decisions to make. And if you're going to be a faithful Christian in that God quest, if you're going to live your baptism well, if you're going to live your Christianity well, then you say, in this situation, in this time, in this place, what's the loving thing to do? Now I'm guessing at some point in our lives, probably we were second and third grade, we learned how to examine our conscience. And lots of people get to adulthood and they're still examining their conscience the same way they did in second grade. You know, and I'm not saying that's a terrible thing to do, but I want to offer you another way to examine your conscience. Say, examine your conscience on this virtue, this theological virtue of love. How have I been a loving person today? How have I shown love? Another word for love, of course, is charity. How have I shown charity today to every person that I've met? One of the ancient practices of the church is a practice that's called examen. And what examen means is that we think about all of the things that have happened in the course of the day, all of the people we've encountered, all of the conversations that we've had, all of the things that have happened in the course of the day. We kind of think about them at the end of the day, and one way to do that is to say, in these conversations, in these encounters, in these even chance meetings I had with people, what did I say? What did I do? And did I do the loving thing? Did I act with charity or not? Now I say that not because I have any criticism of any of you, but I think to myself, I don't always do what I ought to be the loving thing, you know. All of us are busy, right? And if you're like me, you keep a pretty tight schedule. And it works as long as everything goes the way it's supposed to. And then all of a sudden you stop to get gas and the card reader doesn't work. And now you've got to go into the gas station, right? And I find myself cranky with the gas station attendant. Now this is a kid who's probably making $8 an hour, right? Knows nothing about card readers, knows nothing about anything. But their job is to turn the pump on if you haven't been able to do it. And I haven't been able to do it, right? I find myself cranky with that kid. And at the moment, I feel kind of this self-righteous, I'm busy. Don't you know who I am? I have things to do, people to see, places to go, and you're messing up my schedule. That's how I feel, right? And I take my anger out on this kid. And at the end of the day, I say to myself, oh, come on. Why did I do that? You know, if that was my nephew, if that was my niece, I'd feel terrible if people treated them that way. But it's messing up my schedule. And so on any given moment, I might be that cranky customer, you know, or standing in line saying, you know, all the ways that I know that I can not be charitable, not show love. You know, what the practice of examen does is help us to think about what we did and say, boy, that was a bad idea. And then say, next time, what can I do better? Next time, how can I do this better? I gotta tell you, my first thought is next time I'm gonna go to a gas station that has a meter reader that works. That's usually my first thought, you know. But I hope that the next time I go and it just doesn't go the way I hope it is, I hope it does, that I can deal with that person in a charitable way. Now, there's not one of us who can't think about the God quest and bring that kind of theoretical, universal idea that's out there for every one of us and not bring it into our own lives, you know. And if I could take it back to that sense about Jesus again, you know, that Jesus became a particular human being at a particular time in a particular place. And he had to live out his whole life in the context of that particularity. That's true for us too. We who have, you know, taken on Christ, we who have put on Christ, we who have kind of overtly and kind of self-consciously entered into this God quest, that's the same challenge that we have. But not in first century Palestine. That's where Jesus had to live. We live out our particularity in early 21st century North America, Northeast Ohio, greater Youngstown area. That's how we live out our particularity. You know, I often think to myself, or imagine that it must have been easier in a different time or a different place to be holy. You know, if I'd been born in the Middle Ages, you know, it would have been so easy to be holy. You know, I wouldn't have had as many distractions. I wouldn't have Facebook, I wouldn't have television shows, I wouldn't have the newspaper, I wouldn't have great novels, you know, all the things that distract me. It would have been so much easier to be holy. And then I think, gosh, you know, it would have been a lot harder even to get water every day. Where all I have to do to get water is go into the kitchen or into the sink and turn it on and there's water. You know, I have lots of other distractions, but I really don't have the distractions of just getting through every day. You know, if I want to have chicken for dinner, I go to the grocery store and buy chicken, you know? And if I'm really feeling lazy, it's already cooked, right? And still warm by the time I get it home. You know, if they wanted to have chicken for dinner, they had to go in the backyard and say, okay, who's next? You know? And think of all the time it took. I have this illusion that sometimes it would have been easy to be holy in a different day. And yet, every age has its challenge for holiness. Every age has its challenge to be the loving person. And for me, that's probably the most important thing that we should ever attend to, is that God quest and that trying to live holiness.